Welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And today my guest is Nitin Pai. He's the co-founder and director of the Takshashila Institution, an independent think tank and school of public policy based in Bengaluru, India. He has also recently published the book Nitopadesha. We spoke about the role of the citizen, the importance of rhetoric, India's oral tradition, decentralized governance, public policy education, enlightenment values, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi Nitin, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here. It's such a pleasure to talk with you, and we've had lots of conversations, but this is the first one on record, so I'm thrilled that you're here.
Shruti, I'm happy to be on your show where you're giving people ideas about India.
Lovely. And you are transmitting those ideas, which we will get to in a minute. I want to start with your most recent book that you've published. This is called Nitopadesha. And, it's hard to describe this book, but it's very easy to read. So the way I have described the book is if Adam Smith and Elinor Ostrom and George Orwell and Martin Luther King and James Madison and so on were to write Panchatantra and Jataka tales or the Aesop's fables, what you would get is Nitopadesha. Do you think that's a fair description of the book?
Well, yes, because one meaning of the word Nitopadesha is lectures or teachings of policy. So, to the extent that the luminaries that you mentioned somehow make it to the book and their ideas and the values make it to the book, so Nitopadesha would be, no Nitopadesha would be complete without those people, right? So, the most important people we can think of which have to go into a book about public policy.
Public policy is a really loaded term in the sense that, it means something very specific typically within the idea of a given sort of state or nationhood and a particular kind of government and so on. But I feel like the book goes a little bit beyond that in the sense that it might be helpful in teaching public policy or transmitting those ideas. But the book is really about social cooperation. Right? How can people live together in a society and achieve a certain level of well-being and happiness and social cooperation? And social cooperation is critical to that well-being and happiness. And that has three dimensions. It has the dimension of an individual, it has the dimension of a citizen, and it has the dimension of a market participant, right? So, and so there are all these three dimensions. And really what the book or the stories in the book are about, or what they're elucidating is how individuals, or in the case of the book, different species like monkeys and boars and foxes and fish, take on these different roles as these different participants and what they learn from that experience. Is that a good way to think about the book, and was that the effort?
That's right. I think you've unpacked the contents really well. I like to look at it primarily as a book of citizen craft. The word itself is unusual because we have a lot of books of statecraft, right?
Yes.
If you look at Indian philosophy, the Colossus is the Arthashastra by Kautilya, who predated Machiavelli by about 2,000 years, probably 1,500 years, and was more Machiavelli than Machiavelli, right? Like Machiavelli is a guy with a kid with a lollipop in front of Kautilya. A lot of books on political philosophy and statecraft since then have always been about instructing kings and princes. Right, so we have the Panchatantra, which you mentioned, another beautiful classic from Indian history and philosophy. All of us read Panchatantra stories when we were kids, right? Panchatantra stories, for those who are unfamiliar with it, are like Aesop's fables. So they are about animals and human beings who live together, and then at the end of the day, the moral of the story is, right? And we use these stories for moral education. Only when I was 42 years of age. 42 is a good year to get answers.
For many reasons.
When I was 42 years of age, I realized that the Panchatantra is also a book about statecraft. It was written for the education of princes. It was not for the education of individuals and citizens. Then there's Hitopadesha, which is a version of the Panchatantra, which is also a book for the education of princes, right? So it's quite startling that we don't really have a book on citizencraft. We have the dharmas of, being an individual, of a householder, of a king, of a merchant, and all of that, but not what it means to be a citizen. So this book addresses that big gap, right? It fills that gap and says that, look, not only is there something called citizencraft, there is something called the dharma of citizenship, right? Which is the duties of a citizen. I think the word dharma is very hard to translate into English because what it really means is to hold together, right? So it's to hold together a relationship. So when we talk about the dharma of citizenship, it's about holding together the state where there is the citizen and a bunch of citizens, the citizens of the state, and the state machinery which governs the citizens, right? So both these parties have certain set of duties and the proper actions that need to undertake in order to keep the state together, right? So I think this idea of citizencraft is very important in these times because a lot of us have forgotten what liberal democracy is because we've taken it for granted, right? It's patrimony, it's matrimony, or whatever. It comes to us from our parents. We don't really have to water these plants. We don't have to take care of this garden, and we believe that this garden will, bear fruit and have nice flowers every year. That's not true, right? The garden needs tending. Liberal democracy is a lot of hard work, and the right kind of hard work is what this is about. Because you don't want to do the wrong kind of hard work also, because very often, I think we've seen this in India more than other places, is that institutions and individuals do the work which is assigned to the others. So you'll find the judiciary doing the legislature's work, the legislature doing the executive's work, the executive doing everyone else's work, and the citizens believing that, let's take the shortest path to a solution. Ultimately, the citizen looks at this and says, let me take the shortest path to the solution. So if the judiciary is going to give me the answer, so I'll just go to court, right? Or if pleading with my local municipal councillor is going to give me the solution, I'll plead, right? So even citizens are unaware and at some level don't really care what's the right way to get what you want. What happens is when lots of people don't take the right way to get what they want, you end up with a very broken system which stops working for most people, ends up becoming dysfunctional and right? As we see. The rest, as we know, is not history but current affairs.
No, I think that's a lovely way of putting it. But, I feel like you are underselling the theme in the book a little bit. And I'll tell you how I mean that. Everything you said, I completely agree with. But the way we think about the role of the citizen in India is in a legalistic sense, right? There are these rules and then the citizen must follow the rules. And in a very Gandhian and Ambedkarite sense, when the rules are unjust or they are bad, we must, use the system to reform these rules and we must be enlightened and we must agitate and so on and so forth. But the dimension actually I loved about your book is that this has nothing to do with duties in the legal sense. It has duties, not even, morality is also a loaded word, which is why I prefer dharma, but it's about duties in the sense of just, we live in this world and we live with other people. So there's a social duty. If I were to use an enlightenment term, it is moral sentiments, right? As Adam Smith describes it, right? So, he has, of course, the rules of justice, beneficence, and prudence that he describes about how an individual should think about their role in society and markets and live the good life. And yours is more on that dimension. And somehow I feel like that's a lesson that I don't know if it was ever taught in India, but that is the part which has certainly been forgotten. Because everything we read on the role of the citizen, whether it's in the form of duty or privilege, is always in a very legal sense or a legal dimension.
Yeah, you're right. Because I think with dharma, we always get lost in translation, right? Because dharma can translate into duty, dharma can translate into morality, into ethics. It can also translate into responsibility, religion, or a sect of a religion, and so on. What I think this book is doing is, you're right, it's trying to give you 4 dimensions of what it means to be a citizen, right? It's divided into 4 books, the book 1 to book 4. which Bibek Debroy feels is unusual because most of these classics have 5 books. He believes that there's a hidden 5th book, which is to do with karma and love and sex. And I've been too prudish to include it. It's not true. I mean, there are 4 Vedas, right? So it's not necessary to that book should have 5, a text should have 5 books. There are 4 Vedas, so yeah, unless there's a 5th Veda about which we don't know. But anyway, there are 4 books. And the first one is really about the relationship between the citizen and the state and the relationship among citizens. It's not just between the rulers and the ruled, but also among the citizenry. How do you live together as citizens? As you pointed out, I think the idea of different animals really points out to diversity, right? Some animals fly, some animals crawl, some animals swim, and so on. So there is a lot of diversity, and it's how do you live together in a diverse society? How does a diverse society govern itself where it respects pluralism and individual differences? The second book is really a book about economic policy. It's about what are the kinds of economic ideas that are important for prosperity and well-being. I love this word which is in Indian philosophy called Yogakshema. And our translation is happiness, well-being, and prosperity, right?
Yeah, but it's more than that. That's a very basic translation, yes.
Yeah, that's a basic, but I think it brings out the thing, right? You're talking about happiness, well-being, and prosperity. It's about enjoying the fruits of your action, about having the ability to enjoy what you've earned, right? What you've worked for. So that's Yogakshema. And the second book is really about achieving Yogakshema as a society, right? So it's, in a way, if I read through it, there's a lot of Adam Smith in it. So there's this unseen spirit which guides the actions of the community, of participants in markets. There are things about prices and price caps and so on. So those of us who like market economics will really love the second book. There are wonderful stories.
My favorite is Rajni Datta, who said, "It is as the wise say, good conduct is the balance of swartha, which is self-interest, and parartha, which is public interest." And I think this might be in book 1. This was the one thing that jumped out, and I was like, Rajni Datta is the Adam Smith of our time.
Rajni Datta and Chandramani are the 2 crows who are wooing each other. Yeah, actually, Rajni Datta is serenading Chandramani, and Chandramani demands that he come back with a jewel, and I won't reveal the rest, right? The second one is about economic policy, which I think all of us will love because it's about price caps, about setting the price right, and what happens when the price is too high, and what happens when the price is too low, and what happens when there is interference in the market, and so on. I think we love it's something which you can use to teach economics in one lesson without actually using the word economics anywhere. The third book is about ethical dilemmas, right? It's about how, as a citizen, you're often confronted with 2 bad choices or 2 good choices. And you have to choose one of the 2, right? And choosing the better of the 2 good choices or the less worse of the 2 worst choices is not easy, right? So it requires practice. It requires application of mind. And it requires you to have some kind of a moral compass. So the third book talks about that. And the fourth book is really about policy. It's about how ideas translate into policies. And it's not about the government making policy. It's about citizens looking at the options out there and saying, what are the kind of policies that should apply to us? What should we ask for? I always look at this as a typical old Indian story where, there's this person who prays to a certain god for 12 years, standing on one leg, and does a lot of penance and renunciation and so on. And then the god sort of appears, the deity appears and says, what do you want? I'll give you a boon. What's the boon that you want? It's very important to ask for the right boon, right?
And all of Hindu mythology or all of those tales are about how people asked for the wrong boon and gave themselves too much power, which eventually led to their downfall, right?
Yeah,
that is the Asura.
It's there in Greek mythology as well.
Absolutely.
Where you ask for the wrong thing, right? And then it comes back and bites you. But I think in a democracy, we are very often placed in situations where there are governments, there are public officials who want to do good. And then the citizens go and end up asking them the wrong kind of, things, right? In other words, the wrong kind of political pressure manifests itself in democracies, which then puts everything in the wrong kind of a footing. So these are the four books. They are written in the form of traditional Indian storytelling, which are labyrinths. There are stories within stories. It's a little like the Arabian Nights. I suppose the Arabian Nights were also inspired by Indian storytelling. There's a labyrinth and then you have to navigate it. But unlike those very complex ones, I think the labyrinths here are fairly simple. You will find your way out of them. You won't get lost. They're short, each story, and it stands independently, so you don't have to do everything at one sitting. But it helps if you do it at one sitting. And the other thing which is really interesting, which I like, is there's a lot of mystery and there are a lot of riddles and puzzles. There are subtexts. It's almost like reading the Asterix comics and saying, hey, there's name here. This name probably means something. And there's some mischief involved in the names and of places and characters and so on. It gets interesting every time you read it. And I like to look at it that way, that each time a reader reads this book, the reader finds something new, something curious, something puzzling, something which makes this person think a little more about what's actually written there and why it was written.
And the other aspect, which you haven't touched upon so far is, of course, there's the question about, what must a citizen do or how must a citizen think about these questions? But it is also loaded with warnings and messages, subtext and sometimes actual text on how those who govern us must govern. So what happens when bad diktats are issued by overzealous cranes, for instance, is an important lesson. I feel like Vanaketu the mongoose sounds like Napoleon the pig from George Orwell, right? It's sort of at least the precursor to Napoleon the pig. So there are also very specific messages. Maybe the way it is written is to tell the citizens, hey, beware of these sorts of bad actors or these sort of, people who assume too much power or too much authority or who are hungering for a certain kind of power over other people. But it's also a sort of, cautionary tale for those who govern us that it won't end well for them if they are in the world of issuing diktats. So what should people who work on policy, either in the, those who are bureaucrats, who are reading this book to themselves and their kids, I strongly recommend everyone reads this both to themselves and to their children because I think they'll see different dimensions. But, what should a bureaucrat take away from this? What should ministers, or you are in the state of Karnataka, if, the chief minister or home minister of Karnataka happen to read the book, what should they take from this?
See, I think the first purpose of any book, right, any book or a book of fables is to serve as a mirror or a point or a trigger for reflection, right? And I think what happens is when people don't read books, when people go about their lives just doing things, especially when you have, if you're an ordinary citizen like you and I, we have people who will disagree with us. So if I were to say something, my wife, my kids, my colleagues will raise their hands and say, this is a stupid idea. You shouldn't be doing this, right? But what happens is when you acquire some kind of political or social power, the number of people who can respond back to you and say that this is a stupid idea sort of declines.
Yeah.
Instead, you have the opposite. You have a lot of people who want to say, boss, you're right. This is the best thing which happened, right? You are such a genius. You are so smart. This is such a great idea, right? Because that is the way the system works. They want to, puff you up. Because they have their own agenda, right? And it also comes out in one of the stories in this book. So how do you guard against this, right? I think reading is one of the best ways to guard against this. So the first thing which anybody who reads this, it could be a person, who's the leader of a country or a legislator or a public official or just a person who's too full of himself or herself, right? I'm an achiever. I've achieved so much. I'm the boss. I've got this prize. I'm really smart. I think any one of us who feels like that at some point would do well to read something like this. Because what it tells you is that, look, pause, reflect, see what's really happening here. Ask yourself the question that, is this joke really about you? Is this story really about you? Where do you fit in, right? And if you are in that same kind of a situation, how would you react? So I think that's probably one of the best services any book can do to people in power, and especially a book like this, which is meant for, which is meant for people to reflect. it's meant for both sides, right? It's meant for citizens who must know what to ask and what to demand of people in power, and how to behave with people in power, and also for those in power who need to know how to deal with citizens. I mean, the Vanaketu story which you pointed out, it's like Orwell, right? It's something looks like it's out of Animal Farm, where one old corrupt ruler is replaced by a very nice person, and power corrupts absolutely. And then in a matter of time, the one very nice person becomes like the same old guy that you just had to replace, right? So, what in that story, it's very clear that you have to hold the leaders' feet to the fire, right? If you don't criticize them, if you don't give them negative feedback, then it's going to go into their heads, and then they're going to do the same old things which other rulers did, right? So there's simple things like this: hold the feet to the fire. Even if this leader is a leader whom you love, even if this person is someone whom you voted for, even if this person is someone whom you think is really the best answer we have given the circumstances, you are still obliged to criticize that person. Because if you don't criticize that person, you are not doing your duty. You're not doing, you're not even serving the interests of your favorite leader, right? So giving them negative feedback is very important, right? Things like this, I think they permeate the book. Sometimes they're explicit, as you said, and sometimes they're just between the lines.
I have a broader question about these sorts of stories. When we're talking about Jataka tales, which comes from like a Buddhist oral tradition, Aesop's fables, which is of course Aesop and, in ancient Greece, Panchatantra, they're all written thousands of years ago. In fact, it's not even clear if they were ever written. I mean, at some point they became the written word, but largely these were stories that were sort of transmitted from one generation to another through narrative, through the oral tradition. And I guess at some point someone decided to write them down, sort of like Nitopadesha, right? So it feels like this works very well for the Indian context because as a culture in South Asia, we are of the oral tradition, right? Until like a minute ago almost, or maybe a few decades ago, most of the population was not lettered. And the main form of communication was really through the oral tradition. And the oral tradition has a few advantages, which is, one does not have to be very well educated or well read to appreciate the broader points of the story. But the disadvantage of the oral tradition is they are only transmitted within small groups, right? And India is already extremely endogamous, right? So we are really a continent of lots and lots of small groups. That's the way I would characterize South Asia. So how do you think about Nitopadesha in that context? That, it's a wonderful extension of the oral tradition in the written word, and we can think about it as storytelling. But will this all get lost because we are a group of small groups?
No, I don't think it'll get lost. But Shruti, since you're on that topic, the Ramayana and Mahabharata are the two big epics of India, which also were oral tradition until people began to write them down over a period of time, right? So what you have now is like in Southeast Asia we call a kue lapis, which is like a layered cake. There are layers of renderings on top of an old substrate, the old story. So the Ramayana and Mahabharata are the two big ones. But there's a third one. Okay, and the interesting thing about the third one is that it's substantially lost. It's called the Brihad Katha, right, which is the great story. The Panchatantra is part of the Brihad Katha. So there is one extant translation of version of the Brihad Katha, which was done in the 1890s. It's on archive.org. And it runs into, I think, 80 or 90 volumes. Okay, so this is like Tolkien and Harry Potter and Panchatantra and Aesop's Fables and Animal Farm and everything thrown into it. So it's Brihad Katha, right? It's the biggest of all stories. And unlike the Ramayana and Mahabharata, it's not spiritual or philosophical in that sense. It's really about stories. It's about fantasy. And some of them do have contexts where there are, some moral of the story for kings and so on. It's believed that the Brihad Katha is lost. So they have the Katha Sarit Sagar, which is a version of the Brihad Katha, which is there, which is available. And Meena Arora Nayak brought out a translation, an abridged translation of it a few years ago, which is very interesting. I recommend everyone read them. So it's about fantasy. It's about magicians and sorcerers and princes and flying vehicles and so on. On the issue of oral tradition and large numbers of communities, you're absolutely right. The number of people who could read and write those things was small. But what really happened is that these oral texts or oral scriptures, it's a contradiction in terms, right? Oral scriptures.
Which may or may not have been textualized.
Yeah, right. See, these oral things would diffuse across communities. So you would have the same you would have a version of that story in different communities. So you would have a high version of the story which comes from a Sanskrit text, but you might have a popular version of the story which is in one of the local prakrits and so on. So it's not that people didn't know those stories, but people just enjoyed these stories and told these stories to each other in different forms. So it's almost like open source stuff, there is
Absolutely.
a GitHub version which is there, and then you can always download it and you can make your own additions and you can subtractions and modifications and use it, right? And there's no restriction on using it in any way. And I really think that oral tradition has helped people insert a lot of contemporary modernity into those texts. Because you see, unlike the Bible or the Quran, which is the word of God and it is immutable, and because it's written, it is really immutable because there is a written version which is the core version which you cannot change, right? But if you have an oral tradition, you can always interpolate things. You can always put your masala inside, which exactly what people have done, right? Even the Arthashastra has masala, the Ramayana and Mahabharata have masala, the Brihad Katha has masala, the Nitopadesha has masala. So what it allows people like me and people like scholars at every period in history to take what they think is important, which is in a contemporary sense is important, and insert it into the corpus of texts that we have. And no one is the wiser, right? Everybody believes that, this is the Mahabharata which was written 2000 years ago. But the latest parts of the Mahabharata probably are just 500 years ago, So things happen. And I think that's the advantage of an oral tradition, that you can interpolate and no one can come back to you. It's like saying why there can't be fundamentalism, right? In Hindu philosophy, you can't be fundamentalist because there are no fundamentals which are hard and fast, right?
And I would add one more thing, which is unlike the written word, ancient text where the written word is the word, then it also gives a very large amount of power or authority to the interpreters of that word, right? Whereas what happens with the oral tradition is everyone is an interpreter. Because everyone is both the listener and the narrator, right? So the interpretation power sort of diffuses, which is also an important subtext in public policy, right? And this will link to your day job, which is running the Takshashila institution. But for too long a time, when it came to public policy, everything had gatekeepers and interpreters, and it was written in a particular kind of technical speak and had to fit in the part of the central plan, and the only people who could set up educational institutions were the government or, specific minorities who had permission and so on. And this, in some sense, the oral tradition can also democratize in that sense, right? Like there is no gatekeeper and there is no interpreter, which, when it comes to moral tales might be less relevant or maybe equally relevant, but when it comes to public policy, suddenly becomes extremely important.
Yeah, in our case, it was the internet, which was the internet plus oral tradition, which made it democratic, right? Because I still remember when we were talking about Takshashila in 2009, and we said we want to create a public policy school and a think tank, people said, oh, so which government is going to support this? I said, why do you want governments to support this? Because I said, public policy outside government, who's going to do this? I mean, public policy was always seen as something which is administrative training for the people in the civil service or in the police and so on. And you would do an entrance exam to get into the civil service, and then you're in the civil service for life, and then you would be trained by people who are already in the civil service. It was always seen as a preserve of the government. I think what we did with Takshashila, and I'm really happy that after, almost 12 to 15 years, it's become a dream come true, that we've actually made it possible for ordinary people, professionals in various disciplines, people from all backgrounds to go and study public policy, to take an interest in it and study public policy, if not for anything, but to be a good citizen. But that's not all. Like once you study, when smart people study things, they do things with it, right? So we have alumni now who are in the media, who run non-profit organizations, who are scholars and who are professors, academics of public policy in other places, who are in government, who have joined political life, who advise politicians. So, what I really like is this efflorescence of public policy knowledge within the Indian system, where it is no longer something which is seen, which is something which people in government do. It's you and I can do it, my kid can do it, and there are interesting things we can do after it. And I think that's really nice. I don't know whether it's oral tradition or written tradition, but there is definitely a reading tradition because in Takshashila you have to read. So in fact, I joke. Maybe it's not a joke. Maybe it's serious, right? That in many ways, the Takshashila education is a scam because what we really do is get people to read and learn by themselves. And we just say that, hey guys, we're just around, we're just telling you what to read and keeping tabs on what you do. But really, the mileage really comes from reading. So you read widely, you read different points of view, you read logic, you read reasoning, then you debate it out with your classmates and faculty, and then you arrive at some conclusions.
So, Takshashila, I mean, first of all, I'm completely biased. I have served as faculty at different Takshashila courses, and they are some of my favorite people to lecture to because, there's this huge diversity. Unlike my time as a college professor, like they weren't forced to be in that class at 8:30 in the morning or something like that. Like, I mean, these are typically evening classes. These are working professionals who are really excited to be there. They ask the best questions, and Takshashila has now managed to educate 10,000 students? Is that the...
close to 10,000, yeah.
Close to 10,000.
Depending on how I count it, it can be anywhere between 6 to 10,000.
Yeah. So let's say 10. So what you've done basically is you run these lovely public policy certification programs, which can be done alongside a day job. These are all online, and you have a reading list, you have faculty, then you have guest speakers, sort of the role I have served in the past. And you bring these students together. Each cohort sort of forms its own community and people stay in touch. And then out of each group, I mean, there are students there who are studying medicine. There are also people, I think my last group that I was a guest lecturer at, there were lots of people from the military. I'm not sure if there was a particular reason and that was the selection, but there were a lot of people from the military, and they have they serve in the army. That's their job. There are housewives, that's what they say. They're like, oh, I just want to learn more about the world. My kids are sleeping in the other room sort of thing. So you have all these different people. And then in every cohort, you will have someone like Pranay. I mean, Pranay is singular and unique and fantastic, but sort of like him, where it sparks something in their mind and they decide, oh, we really wish to do this, as a career, and then they go on to do this. So there are a lot of students who've then gone on to, some of them have come to the United States. I'm in touch with them. They've gone to schools of public policy and so on. So you've obviously influenced very large number of people in a very specific way and incubated them. When you started, was this the goal, and are you happy with how this has played out? Like, was this the way you wanted to conduct public policy education, and you figured out that this is the right model and this is the way to go and you're just going to keep doing this?
Yeah. So, the model from the beginning, the Takshashila model has been drawing inspiration from the old Takshashila, which is a cosmopolitan university town where it was an intersection of Hindu, Chinese, Persian, Bactrian, Central Asian cultures and sciences. And it was really the Oxford or Harvard of that period. Our inspiration was, what can we do like something like that for the 21st century? And the model really is not so much to do the Washington or the Delhi Beltway kind of a system where you're trying to influence policy directly. Our model is to connect good people to good ideas to good networks, right? So you need good people who are smart, who are passionate, who have the right set of values, who have an open mind, and who have the drive to go and change things. Equip them with the right side of knowledge and ideas such that, it's just teaching basic economics to a person has great externalities, right? Because suddenly this person understands at a level how things work, and then you can help things change. So that's good people, good ideas to good networks and opportunities where they can make change. Now, one of the early conversations I had with Pratap Bhanu Mehta was 2010, we were talking about the Takshashila model and what I intended to do and how to run it. And he said something which I still remember. He said you have to flood the system with good people. Because, I mean, look at India, right? It's 1.4 billion people. The union government alone is about 4.5, 5 million. So if you exclude the railways, it's probably 3 million people in the union government. And each state probably has about a million people in the civil service. And despite this, we are underserved, right? We have the lowest amount of administrator to citizen ratio. I mean, the doctor to patient ratio, or police to citizen ratio, fire service to citizen ratio. Anything you look at it, we are underserved, right? So we are a huge country, and the number of people who are actually doing anything about public policy is small. So if you were to produce 100 graduates every year, that's not going to make a difference at all. We are producing about 1,000 graduates every year, and I still think that's inadequate, right? But if you try and do 10,000 or 100,000 graduates, then of course you're not going to have the kind of quality, be able to assure a certain level of quality, right? So for us, really, Takshashila wants and is doing, what it's doing is creating thousands of people every year. But more importantly, I think we've inspired enough number of people to create public policy schools around the country. People who have deep pockets, people who are in the education space, people who think now that public policy is a career that will demand good people, and money can be made out of it. So there are commercial public policy schools which are charging decent amounts of money to teach people. And I think that's where the change is coming from, right? And we're really happy to share our DNA, our secret sauce with anyone who wants to set up public policy schools, right? Whether it's in India or abroad, we are very happy to share this. We've done this largely with donor money, and I think we have an obligation to share that knowledge and the secret sauce with whoever who wants to do a good job out of it. Ultimately, that's how change happens, right? That you have people who are inspired, people who can go out and do interesting things, and you just need to set things on fire.
There are two elements, I think. I mean, one of the elements that you haven't mentioned and the other one you did. So one is the bigger picture question of what is our role in society and what society needs and what we need in public policy and so on. And you're absolutely right, like Pratap, you need to flood the system. They need the importance of, or the primacy of ideas, which is incubated through individuals and networks and so on. But the second part of that is, at the end of the day, you are offering a certification program at a very basic level, and it has to give value to students, right? And if it doesn't give value, then they are not going to give you their time, let alone any, basic amount of fees that you may charge for materials or something like that. And I think what I have really appreciated about Takshashila is the value component of it, right? I have my own students who've done the GCPP course. One of my very close associates, Shreyas Narla, who works with us at the Maketa Center and is a co-author with me on multiple projects, is one of your alums. And I have heard in exceptional detail about how valuable each hour of the course is and how valuable those readings are. And people go back to those readings all the time. So I think oftentimes those of us who embark on very big think projects and we try to change the world, we forget about the basic market value proposition, right? And I think Takshashila has somehow managed to keep that at the center of all of it.
Yeah. See, I think I said, I was happy to hear what you said. But here's the thing, right? It all starts with your objective, right? Takshashila is anchored in India, but global in outlook, right? In the sense that we are not looking at India as the end of the universe, right? India is a part of the world, and world is part of the universe, and whatever we do should change the world and the universe as well. But you need to start with that passion to say that, look, I can't accept this state of affairs, right? India at this stage of its growth and development cannot afford to have lousy governance. We cannot have bad roads. We cannot have air pollution, right? We cannot have problems with our national security. These are suboptimal, and we should be able to solve them, right? So I think the first value proposition we really represent is people who are dissatisfied with the status quo come to Takshashila and find out two things. A, that there are better ways of solving the problem, and B, there are other people like you who are also interested in solving the problem, right? And these two things are the foundations of everything else. Because you could say that, look, I'm not alone. I think I don't have to reinvent, or I don't have to figure out how to, purify water in order, clean water supply to people, right? It's a solved problem. I now know that it can be done. I also know how to look at solutions. I know how to evaluate different types of solutions and decide what works best for me and for us in my community. And that's not all. There are 500 other people who are interested in the same problem and the same solution, right? And what are the other people doing? Even if I don't gang up with the 500 and do something together, I could see that, one person has taken this particular approach to solving the problem. So why not I do the same, right? I can just emulate that model in my backyard, right? So what happens is there is solidarity in numbers, there's solidarity in problem solving, and that, I think, creates the foundation for everything else. So what happens is a lot of people like your colleagues go on to do higher education, masters and PhD programs in economics, public policies, social sciences, etc. A lot of others are so inspired that they decide to go switch careers from private sector career to social sector, non-profit organizations, NGO, and things like that. And in the last 5 years, and this is really nice, this is really cool, a lot of people have decided that they have public policy careers within the private sector, because a lot of industry now is in a situation where it has to be aware of public policy. I mean, it's unfortunate there's a lot of government intervention and state intervention in markets everywhere in the world, right? It's not just India alone. Everybody is doing it. So that means private companies must know what governments are doing and must know how to deal with governments properly. So that's created a sunrise industry in itself, right? But there's also a lot to do with technology, because a lot of the technology industries are new. They don't have mental models. The political systems where they operate don't have mental models. So you have to engage with the political system, with society, to come out with governance architectures that work for your industry, right? So a lot of people in the private sector are continuing to do wonderfully in their public policy careers within private companies.
The state is so overwhelming in India, right? So this is there recently in Pranay and RJ's book. That's, Rohini Nilekani talks about it in her book. So we think about the system as, Samaj, Sarkar, Bazaar, which is society, governments and markets. But governments, which is Sarkar, is sort of overwhelming the other two areas, right? So to some extent, whether you're a school teacher or whether you work in a corporate job or whether, you're stay-at-home mom trying to figure out what school to send your kids to or how to navigate some, public good or clean water in the Resident Welfare Association, it just feels like some minimum knowledge of public policy would be immensely useful, because the government seems to be overwhelming every single aspect of life, right? So in some sense, the extent of government by itself has produced a huge demand for a course or an institution like Takshashila, which is unfortunate because that's what it's trying to fix. But, on the other hand, that seems to be one part or the source of the demand. So it's not really about the day job, the division of labor between tech versus, economics or policy or something like that. It's just, this is something that's actually useful to everyone.
Yeah, and that's why the Nitopadesha, that's why the book came into being. Because what you're really talking about is, you don't have to go to every citizen and say, here's this book by Tyler Cowen, read economics, right? Or here's this book by Douglas North, even by Pratap Bhanumehta or whatever. You don't need, it's not possible, right? It's not something which they can do, or it's not something which they would want to do unless you put a gun to their head, right? What does it mean to be a citizen, right? What does it mean to be a resident in an apartment complex? What does it mean to be a citizen in a new town? You just moved to a new town. And what does it mean to be there, right? So these are some things which must come to you as part of civic education. Unfortunately, civic education in India is dead because everybody does high school civics, and it's somehow, it's something which you have to just get done with, right? It's about, how old do you need to be a president of the country of India? It's 35 years of age. Okay, you've got 5 marks and move on. And everybody ignores civics because civics is such an ignorable subject. I mean, it's such a technical subject. You just do multiple choice and you are done with it. But what civic education really has to be is about teaching people how to live with each other, right? What's the morality of living with each other, right? What are the compromises that you need to make to live with each other? And why are those compromises necessary? Our civic education just doesn't do this. I don't know whether they do this in the United States, but certainly not in India, right? Although we do have curriculum, we do have a syllabus which says civics in 7th grade, or the court legislated they must teach constitutional values in every undergraduate program. So technically you have this in your syllabus, but it's only technically, right? Because no one really pays attention to it. So we've got to find ways to make it available to a lot of people in a non-threatening, non-technical way. I suppose fables are a good way to get there, because people remember them, right? Even you and I remember Aesop's fables. You and I remember Tinkle comics and Amar Chitrakatha and so on, right? Or Tintin and Tintin, as my French educated children tell me. It's not Tintin,
Yes.
but Tintin. Yeah, but fine, Tintin, right? Tintin.
So, Deirdre McCloskey has this wonderful book and, also paper, The Rhetoric of Economics. That's what the paper and the work is called. And what she means there by rhetoric is not mere rhetoric, like, in the sense of, oh, this is not just some kind of manipulated or constructed narrative or, something to dumb things down or to grandstand. In fact, rhetoric is the point because it's the primary means of persuasion, right? And it is the word craft is the tool that, people use when it's good rhetoric. And that essay was written primarily for economists who have become, extremely technical. And this is sort of like a modernist version of, technical economics where everything is in Greek letters. And the broader point of, we engage with human behavior and basically what are extremely important social problems gets lost in some of that, and how economists need to bring back that, the big exercise of persuasion through rhetoric. I saw the, Nitopadesha also from that lens, which is, it is not that, you don't have to dumb down the law of demand to explain it to a child, right? The law of demand is the law of demand, right? Or the division of labor, or, separation of powers, and all these important themes which are there in the book. And it's really a great sort of, rhetorical tool, so to speak, right? Do you view the book as that kind of an effort? So, that's part one of the question. And the second is more generally, because you're so deeply involved in public policy education in India, what is the role of rhetoric in public policy?
Yeah, see, I would just shift the context of what you said from rhetoric to discourse, right? Where rhetoric is part of discourse.
Part
right?
of discourse, yeah.
Now, the challenge is that any democracy is only as good as its discourse. When you have good discourse, whether through rhetoric, storytelling, narratives, traditions, respectful debate. India, for example, has a tradition of respectful debate, right? Where Purva Paksha, it's actually, when you read it, it's very interesting. You're supposed to accurately characterize your opponent's arguments before you go on and deconstruct them. You're not considered a legitimate debater until you can give the best form of your opponent's arguments first, right? So unless you have systems and traditions where discourse is seen as something important, something which needs to be preserved and strengthened, the outcomes of society suffer, especially an outcome in a democracy suffers. Because how do you decide what's important in a democracy, right? How do you decide the pros and cons, good and bad of issues, right? It's only through discourse. Now, what happens is when discourse gets polluted, when discourse gets destroyed, you end up destroying democracy. And I think the big story of our age is really how the early information age discourse has taken a severe beating because of the social media as we know it today, right? The interaction between human psychology and networks has created a situation where you just can't have a civilized debate anywhere in any country anymore. It's very polarized. It's just lobbing verbal grenades at each other and insulting each other and so on. So we've got to rescue discourse. Now, rhetoric is certainly one way to do this. A well-argued case can transform through rhetoric, even if the case itself is weak, right? So this is good lawyers all the way from Cicero to the present day. Good lawyers do that, right? Rhetoric. So it's an appeal to parts of your brain and parts of your cognition which are not only receptive to logic, right? To a lot of other things. Narratives are others. How do you spin stories, grand arc stories, which can propel a certain kind of value system and which can then result in certain kinds of policies being adopted, right? Then there's also traditions of debate. I think most democracies are losing their traditions of debate. Televising parliament was a bad idea, I guess, because everyone is now acting as Hindi film stunt people, not as politicians, because you do stunts there and you don't do debates. So I think we've got to rescue theater. This. It's just theater. No, it's not just theater. It is a boxing ring, right? It's freestyle wrestling. It's not just theater. It's a blood sport in some ways. So I think we've got to rescue discourse. There is a story in the Nitopadesha which talks about it, right? It's like, unless you figure out a way, as a society, figure out a way to be nice to each other and have improve your discourse, you're going to get worse every year. So how we can do this, I have no idea. I mean, I have many ideas, but I have no single idea. But what I do know is that all of us, every one of us who has a platform, either as a podcaster, as a social media influencer, as a teacher, as a columnist, as a blogger, just a bloke who's on Twitter, I think we have a responsibility to improve the level of discourse. If we don't take that seriously, I think we're all done for.
On discourse, I mean, I agree that we're very polarized. That's not a quality judgment. That is just, more a description of how things are. But, in terms of quality, I am always a little nervous about talking about the quality of discourse. I worry that it's a little elitist, in the sense that the entire purpose of the new Indian Republic exercise was to democratize education, was to democratize citizenship, right? Have sort of universal adult franchise, have everyone participate in the legal part of society, right? And other parts of society, people are free to choose whether they participate or not. And we've, of course, done our very best to democratize education, right? So there is, of course, the constitutional right to education, but there's also all these universal education mandates of, the union government, all the state governments and so on. We had to scale this education to 1.4 billion people, which is hard to do with any kind of state capacity, but incredibly hard to do with the modern Indian state capacity. But the acceptable level was what was decided by the elites, and the education curriculum was based on what Macaulay said, 150 years ago. So the discourse is what it is, right? So now in terms of quality, I worry that in the very short run, there is a trade-off between democratizing discourse, opening up different media like the internet, telecom, satellite television, satellite news channels, newspapers, blogs, everything. So there's a trade-off between really democratizing both the medium of writing and the medium of publishing, and between what is out there. And as all the systems mature, not just India matures as a democracy, but also as we mature as the largest education provider in the world, right? As we mature as a healthier or a more mature newspaper community, or a more mature sort of satellite, news, television, cable news community, I feel like the quality will improve. So I'm always nervous about judging quality from where I'm currently sitting, because I feel like the way to improve quality very quickly is to clamp down on who gets to enter and exit. And we don't want that. And allowing everyone to enter on Twitter, which is a lovely thing, standalone, will also cause a very high degree of noise and, terrible quality babble. And I don't think that's standalone a bad thing.
Shruti, in the past few years, I've been interested in digital democracy, right? So one of the things I'm working on is, how does democracy look like in the information age? Because the democracy which you have today, representative democracy, is an artifice of the industrial age, right? So you have 500 people who have been selected, who are supposed to apply their mind and then vote on issues, right? So the idea is that you make policies, you make laws by the consent by the majority, and it's like ruled by consent. But the mechanism is of representative democracy, where you have some people who are elected and who function in parliament and do this. But how does this look in the information age, right? I don't have, fully formed thoughts to share with you right now. But one thing I found is that different parts of society do different things well in a democracy. Now, I'll give you an example. If you want to characterize a problem, right? Let's say the problem of education or a problem of universal education. Now, if you consult a billion people, you will get a very rich, very deep, very, very comprehensive definition of the problem, right? Because the more people you consult, the more issues they'll add on. So you'll get a very complex, very rich idea of the problem. But a billion people are not well placed to create solutions and probably not even well placed to select those solutions. Okay. What I mean by that is, things like taxes is very counterintuitive, right? A billion people can decide that taxes are not necessary, right? And then, of course, then we have zero taxation. So I'm very scared of, or Brexit is another example, right? Suddenly you have everybody gets to vote and they say, we decided to jump out of the European Union. And now you say, oh my God, what do we do now, right? So I think there are challenges to direct democracy, right? In the sense that getting people to, especially a billion different people, to make solutions, design policies. It is an elite enterprise. Like it or not, it is an elite enterprise. The Constitution of India was written by the elite, right? But it is not an elitist document at all, right? So it's a great example to show that a bunch of really elite, the elite in India in 1940 were probably eliter than the elite of India today, right? So yet they created a document which is so far ahead of its time that even if we decide it by popular vote today, we probably won't create something like that, right? So I think what is important is to figure out the best set of people or the best segment of society to perform a particular function. So you want the masses to define the problem, give you a rich idea of the solution. You want the masses to decide who should have power, right? You want the masses to decide should be a legitimate holder of power, whom should we entrust political power with. Political power and technocratic knowledge are not the same, right? So Shruti and Nitin can probably design a fantastic tax policy for our country, but Shruti and Nitin might not be the kind of people who want to entrust power to, right? We might, so these are two different things. So I think digital democracy allows us options to separate this out for the first time in human history. So you could get a billion people in for certain things. You can get 50 million people for some other things. You can get 500 of economists to do certain things. And then you can get maybe 20,000 of the most social leaders to be the political leaders, right? So you can do all of these. I think it's a fantastic space to work in, where you can reimagine what democracy ought to look like in the information age. And I think India is probably well placed to implement that when, maybe gradually, but we are very, very well placed to implement that.
Yeah, and to be honest, I find the idea of 1.4 billion people coming together to decide anything quite frightening. You have a family, I have a family, we can't figure out what restaurant we should go to for dinner. And then we end up going to the same place because, we can't come to an agreement. Everyone wants to go somewhere else. And we're like, oh, this is one thing that everyone can agree upon. And we know we like it. We've been there before. Let's just do that. The idea that we all need to come together and agree upon things and that is necessarily what democracy means is one that's not clear to me or obvious to me. And the second is, I don't even know if it's a desirable goal with desirable outcomes, right? And if we observe places where you have direct democracy and this sort of the referenda that work really well, it works very well on a very small scale, sort of like the Swiss cantons, right? That's where it works really well. And it works very well when there is a reasonable degree of homogeneity and a minimum standard of education, linguistic skills that everyone has. Because the most important part of direct democracy and voting on a referendum question is to understand the question and for everyone to think that the question means the same thing that the other person thinks. Now we know with some post-Brexit literature that not everyone knew what it really means and that common understanding was missing, though everyone spoke English. And that's exactly what you are alluding to, that common understanding sometimes is an elite question and a matter of an elite education, right? If it's a tax reform question, you actually need to know something about public finance and economics, right? As opposed to if it's a religious question, then you may need to either be practicing in that religion or you need, maybe you need to be a scholar or a theologist or a priest. But you need different kinds of expertise, right? The very few things that you need absolutely zero expertise for is to decide what level of a public good or service you choose to use, right? So in that sense, I feel like the model for India has to be small. Democratic decisions have to be small for it to make sense when they are big. And what I mean is 99% of the problems that Indians face have nothing to do with the problems that other Indians face in other parts of the country, right? So except something like, how to guard our borders, right? Or a space mission, right? Or tax policy, currency, macroeconomic stability, treaty formation. There are very few areas where everyone is sort of in the same boat. For everything else, when we talk about modern day governance and democracy, the questions are very, very specific. So I would say actually the way India needs to go is have thousands of, local governments and the very, very few things where agreement must come from everyone in the country, all the states and all the districts and all the panchayati raj and urban local bodies and so on. Those are the things that you leave to the political and the elite and the technocratic class by representation. So to make it simpler, what I think we need more generally in terms of democracy in the digital age, and specifically for a country as large as India, is lots of smaller units of democracy and lots of experimentation. And India is exactly flipped that on its head, right? Some of this is a colonial heritage, some of it comes from central planning, but we are extremely centralized. Everything from, the design and the size of the toilet that will be dispersed comes from the union government. I mean, the whole thing is bonkers, the way we govern, which also leads to implementation challenges. And, you're familiar with all the problems. But I think federalizing, decentralizing, that is, I think, the key to democratic decision-making in the digital age. Though everything about digital age leads you to believe the opposite. It reduces transaction costs so much that you think everyone can talk to everyone can understand each other. Simply not the case, I think.
Yeah, but the thing is, put it this way, this insight has to contend with the reality that India does not have a culture of decentralized egalitarianism or decentralized equity, right? Ambedkar said, look, Gandhi's ideas of self-governing villages would be terrible because you don't know what happens in those places. And it's true. I mean, all of us have horror stories about RWA meetings where, people just decide to take it upon themselves to do exactly what they want. So we don't have that tradition of egalitarianism at the grassroots. We have traditions of governance at the grassroots. A panchayat, for example, is a tradition. I mean, there are very strong panchayats, right? There are, even if they are not caste panchayats, they might be, village panchayats or town panchayats. There's a very strong tradition of governance at those, but they are not egalitarian. They are not equities. I mean, the equity dimension is very low. They are very hierarchical. There are multiple conflicts of interests. There are social issues which we will find abhorrent, which are condoned by panchayats and so on. So while a decentralized model is a realist answer to India's governance problems, the realism is pretty devoid of idealism, right? So in the sense that the values that we want to see, equality under the law, is probably the first thing that goes for a toss in a panchayat. In various ways, it's not necessarily because of Manu Dharma Shastra, that particular way. Different, I've seen that it depends on the power structure, the social power structure in different places. That basically determines how your panchayat works. That also determines who gets the first dibs on water resources, who gets the first dibs on markets, real estate and so on. And that's also finding its way into the constitutional panchayat system that we have, right? Because that's social reality. So I think we have to find ways that can deal with these two contradictions at the same time. The fact that A, decentralized democracy is probably the best way to govern India, and B, that decentralized democracy does not mean egalitarianism or anything that we see in the in the preamble of the Constitution, right? It's the opposite thereof.
It can be the opposite thereof. There I agree with you. I'll tell you my two thoughts on that. The one thing that makes me optimistic, especially in 2023, relative to even 1950 when the Constitution was written, is freedom of movement. This is one of the constitutional guarantees that has not been subverted, except something like COVID, when we had this crazy lockdown. So India still guarantees freedom of movement. Indians migrate in the millions, right? In the hundreds of millions now, very soon. And some of it is seasonal, some of it is complicated. It's not like life is great after they have migrated because they're basically coming from very difficult circumstances, lack of education, lack of human capital, lowest in the social hierarchy and so on. But unlike when Ambedkar was debating Gandhi on this question, exit is a very realistic option from that den of localism that Ambedkar described, in villages, which was not the case when, railways were relatively new when Ambedkar was having this debate, right? Railways for humans as opposed to just cargo. So I think that's an important point to underscore. The second point there is part of the digital democracy, which is, we have 86, 87% cell phone penetration in India. So this is again not the den of localism at a time where you can't find information and things won't reach you unless the, local power structure allowed those books and resources and TV news and, things to reach you. So, these are two important changes since when that debate happened. And I don't know if they would have had the exact same point of view if they were debating with those two, important pieces of information or changes in society. The second thing, and I don't know if this makes me an optimist or a pessimist compared to you, I feel like everything else in society, democratic participation and behavior is something that can't be taught, but it's something that can be learnt. And you can only have good democracy, by doing it many, many, many times over. Which is why democracies that have crossed a threshold of a certain number of decades or years of being democratic just kind of stay that way. And countries, or states which every few years have devolved into a coup or have broken down, that fate keeps repeating, over and over again. I feel like we have learned some good behaviors, as a democracy, especially the citizens, when it comes to voting. We vote in large numbers. For Panchayati Raj, we are now nearing 30 years, right? So we're talking about 5 to 6 electoral cycles of Panchayati Raj and urban local bodies after the 73rd and 74th Amendment. Now, that's not enough. 6 iterations is very little in some sense. But there is some sense in each of these communities that we're learning how to do this. And frankly, past a point, the only way how to learn how to do it better is to actually keep doing it. So right now, what's happened with Indian Panchayati Raj is we're very good at voting and appointing the leaders. We're good at following the rules. All the panchayats which are reserved for women or SC, ST, we actually do manage to, implement that. Earlier iterations had something called the, Pati Sarpanch, where even though the women were elected, it were their husbands who were ruling. Newer iterations, I believe Pati Sarpanch is almost, now it's just folklore. It's almost disappeared. Because we've had 6 iterations of this. And now the women who are, we know that women can take charge and run the panchayat. So similarly, unless we give these municipal bodies actual fiscal revenue raising power and revenue spending power, they'll never quite learn how to do it. And I'm very optimistic about learning, So I'm as pessimistic as you are about, what is the reality in many of these, panchayats and villages, and things are quite bad and, it's not equitable. But I'm very optimistic that they can actually learn how to do better, I don't know why. But that seems to be my today's optimism. It may change tomorrow.
No, and I think there's grounds for that, because I think one thing which is a strong driver towards growth, development, and better politics in India is the optimism that exists in society, and optimism and hopefulness that exists in society that things will get better over time. I don't know why Indians have that, but lots of surveys show that we are the most optimistic nation in the world. And that is a strength, because optimism creates the future that you want, right? It brings about the future that you want. So if you're pessimistic and you're in despair, you're anxious, you create the future that you sort of fear. So if you're optimistic, you create. So in that sense, the vectors of hope, the vectors of optimism are India's greatest strength. And they are largely responsible for the positive changes that you see. But as an engineer, I look at the first and the second derivatives also, right? How fast are these things happening? How are things accelerating? How can we accelerate things? So moving in one direction is fine, but for a person like me, I'm impatient. I want to see change within a generation, right? Especially when it is possible to have prosperity within a generation, when it is possible for you to enjoy living standards and quality of life, changing within a generation. We know the solutions, right? We know how it's done. China has shown, for example, how prosperity can be acquired in a generation. Now, there are lots of things which are wrong with the Chinese model, but take it out and look at it from if you go onto the planet Mars and look at what's happening, here's a country which has shown that you can do things within a generation. And then I'm here and I say, look, why are we not doing it? And there is a moral imperative for you to do it as quickly as you can, right? Because each day lost is the day. I mean, for you and I, it's fine. But for people who are not as privileged as we are, each day lost is a big loss.
On this, I do want to ask you one thing. This is both for you as a teacher of public policy and also someone who contributes to this discourse and has made this point many times over. There are a few of us who are in the same camp, which is that economic growth is a moral imperative, right? This is not one of those nice to have things. This is absolutely essential. And we've written similar arguments, both you and I and many of our colleagues. Why is the idea of economic growth being so important, so missing in the larger discourse, both on public policy and, any kind of policy decision making or discussion among citizens, or, it's just not the topic of conversation in the air. So, earlier my sense used to be, these are very technical questions and people may not know compound interest and, how things compound and, so on and so forth. But I have seen that we are the generation, and most of, Indians today who are, 2/3 of Indians are younger than you and me, right? So all of them, they have very much reaped the benefits of economic growth at 5 or 6% per annum. So why is this not a universal or near universal demand? Why is it not, the thing that is discussed every day on news channels or in op-ed articles? This always baffles me.
See, I think it's because people don't connect what they really want with the idea of economic growth. Right? In the sense that maybe we can blame our friend Anupam Manur for the failures of this, that people don't understand macroeconomics. Right? People don't understand that there is a macroeconomy. Now, you talk to anybody in India, they are concerned about making more money tomorrow than they have today. Across the pyramid. And it's not just in India, it's everywhere around the world. I don't think you'll find any country where large numbers of people say, we don't worry about we don't want to make money, we are happy. There is this funny bunch of people who are talking about degrowth in your side of the planet.
They're not funny. I think the word you're looking for is stupid and ill-informed, but we'll use funny maybe.
Yeah. So other than those funny guys with funny ideas, most people think that, prosperity is something which they want for themselves and for their families and around them. Now, how do you connect prosperity at an individual level to this idea of economic growth as a policy goal that a country should follow, right? I think that connect is lost. And I think it's not a surprise, because in India or in Indian politics, any connect with a macro policy solution is always lost. I want to have better roads outside my house, but transportation policy, I don't care about transportation policy, right? I want to have a clean street outside, but climate policy, how does climate policy? So it's like that. So the macro is always lost in conversation. Maybe it's because of the kind of polity we are. Maybe it's universal, I don't know. But I don't think there's anybody in India or in any part of, as I said, who says, look, we don't want prosperity. Everybody wants to be prosperous. We have Shubh Labh written outside our houses, right? In almost every house in India, you have Shubh Labh, which says, what does it translate? Shubh is good.
Auspicious.
Yeah, Shubh is auspicious and Labh is profit. So we are all asking for profits, right? And Lakshmi is the goddess of choice of most families. So
Yes and no, but I think this goes back to the starting point of our conversation on Nitopadesha, which is, when the gods show up before you, you must know what you ask for, right? And I think that's where I'm always confused as to why economic growth is not the number one thing people ask for. Because there is a general sense that when the economy is doing well, there are more jobs, people make more money. So I feel like it could be one of two, three different things. One thing could be they think that when they're doing well, it's all about them. And when they're doing badly, it's all about bad government policy, or external factors. So, that's one possible, and this is a behavioral tendency. So, it's wholly possible that people think that way. The other is, of course, as you mentioned, there is a loss of, transmission in the ideas, right? Between what causes economic growth at the macro level and what I think I'm immediately concerned with at the local level. Both of these things put together still don't explain to me why people are constantly demanding welfare entitlements, but never economic growth. They never ask for Shubh Labh from the government, though they have it outside their homes and they worship Lakshmi. What they ask of the government is very, very specific welfare transfers, right? I want jobs reserved for my community or my gender or, my age group. We want LPG subsidies or fertilizer subsidies. Like these are very specific demands. So Indians do make specific demands. It just never tends to be economic growth.
Yeah, I don't have an answer, and I don't even have a hypothesis actually. But what the observation is simply this, right? That all demands we make tend to be about private benefit. This is that Swartha Parartha balance which we were talking about, which is there in the book also. That it's all about Swartha, right? People go to a temple and pray and say, look, if I get good marks in this exam, I'll break a coconut, right? Or if I were to succeed in my business, I will give you a golden bell in this temple, right? So it's always about me, right? It's a deal that you're cutting with God. So similarly, it's a deal that you're cutting with government to say that give me the welfare, right? I'm not concerned about the macro, right? I'm not concerned about the parartha. So I think the Nitopadesha points this out, that you need to have this balance right. The Swartha Parartha balance has to be right. I think it's very askew. In most contexts in India, it is a Swartha, which is a dominant motivation. And Parartha is just, an offside. You're seldom worried about the interests of the collective. You're always concerned about your own very narrowly defined private interests.
And I would add one more thing to that, which is, I think it's fine for people to be concerned about their narrow individual or private interest. But I think what is missing more generally in the discourse is that self-interest can be aligned with social interest. And it is only the question of the right institutions, right? So this is something that Adam Smith has pointed out to us, all the Enlightenment scholars many times over, that it is not that we fundamentally need to suppress or reform our self-interest. It is that we need to make sure that they align with the more general social interest or public interest. Markets will do that for the most part when it comes to allocating goods and services and increasing the size of the pie. You need very specific kind of democratic institutions and checks and balances to make sure that the same thing translates into polity. And of course, you need, social rules, norms. Sometimes they tend to be religious rules and norms. Sometimes they can be of very specific communities and regions that tell you how, even within society, right, individual interest can be aligned with self-interest. And that's also one of the larger themes in Nitopadesha. So, this enlightenment value, I think, is what is missing in public policy overall, that it can be done.
And I think what I think is important is for us in India to have the most basic sense of us that translates my family, my clan, my caste group, my state, right? And to say that all of us is the us. The us is not a small you, but a big you. And I think that probably is the missing factor, right? To the extent that we can get to the big you, a lot of these problems are easily solvable. And how do you get to the big you? Don't ask me, it's above my pay grade.
I don't think it's above your pay grade. I think it's just a matter of, the next book, Nitopadesha Part 2 or Book 5, as, Vivek has been demanding. And hopefully we will get to some of those themes there. But this was such a pleasure. I loved the book. I loved reading it. Thank you for publishing it and for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me on your show. Enjoyed talking to you. I think it's triggered some thoughts which I've now go out and work on. Thank you very much for that.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.